On August 3, 1492, 3 small ships left the port of Palos in Spain. They weren't impressive. They weren't heavily armed for war. They weren't large, fast, or designed for fame. In fact, by most standards, they were ordinary, almost fragile vessels, barely equipped for the vast unknown of the Atlantic. And yet, as these humble ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, pulled away from the Spanish coast, no one could have imagined that they were carrying the seeds of a transformation that would forever alter the course of human history. That day, geography, once an invisible and immutable force, was about to be challenged, and the world itself would never look the same. For centuries, Europeans believed the world had limits. They had maps, but most of these were incomplete, speculative, and often wildly inaccurate. Africa was charted along the coasts. Asia was known in fragments. But the lands across the Atlantic remained a mystery. The Americas, if anyone had ever heard rumors of them, were considered myths at best, dangers at worst. Geography was not just a backdrop to human life. It was a barrier. Mountains, deserts, and oceans weren't just physical features. They were the edges of human understanding, the invisible fences that define the limits of exploration and trade. The Atlantic Ocean, in particular, was seen as an almost insurmountable wall. Its vast waters separated continents by thousands of miles. Ships that dared venture too far west often never returned. Stories of tempests, monstrous waves, and endless horizons had filled European imaginations with both fear and fascination. To cross that ocean was to confront the unknown itself. Yet it was precisely this unknown that sparked the curiosity, ambition, and, yes, greed of explorers like Christopher Columbus. These men would challenge the limits that geography had imposed, and in doing so, they would set into motion a chain of events whose consequences no one could predict. Columbus set sail with a small crew of 90 men. They were ordinary sailors, fishermen, and adventurers, following a man who promised not riches in gold, but a new route to the riches of Asia. Their mission was simple in description but profound in ambition: to find a westward route to Asia, a shortcut to the fabled lands of spices, silk, and gold. European kingdoms were hungry for trade, desperate to bypass intermediaries in the Middle East, and eager to secure direct access to the treasures of the East. Yet what Columbus and his men didn't know was that the world was far larger than anyone had imagined, and that the lands they hoped to reach were not where they expected. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. At first, the sailors were filled with excitement, a mix of wonder and anticipation. But as the journey stretched on, doubt began to spread like a shadow over the small ships. The horizon never ended. The ocean seemed infinite. Storms battered the hulls, supplies dwindled, and the fear of the unknown gnawed at every man on board. Navigational tools of the era, the compass, the astrolabe, knowledge of the winds and currents, were impressive for their time, but they were still human-made attempts to measure and control a vast, untamable ocean. And yet, on October 12, 1492, the unimaginable happened. Land was sighted. Not the rich cities of Asia that Columbus had envisioned, but a cluster of islands in what we now call the Caribbean. The world had just revealed itself to be bigger, more complex, and far more interconnected than anyone had previously understood. Geography, which had seemed like an unyielding barrier, had transformed into a bridge. The islands Columbus landed on were home to peoples he had never seen before: the Taino, the Arawak, and other indigenous groups. For Europe, these lands were an opportunity, a new frontier to explore, trade with, and exploit. For the Americas, the encounter was far more complex, fraught with consequences that would be catastrophic in some cases: disease, conquest, cultural upheaval, and the destruction of entire civilizations. Geography had placed two worlds together that had never interacted before, and the Atlantic Ocean, which had once divided them, now became a conduit for exchange, migration, and, tragically, devastation. Before 1492, European trade with Asia relied on long, treacherous land routes. The Silk Road, caravan trails, and maritime paths around Africa. Spices, precious metals, silk, and other commodities were rare, expensive, and often dangerous to transport. Each journey involved months of travel, negotiations with foreign rulers, and the constant threat of banditry or natural disaster. But suddenly, with the discovery of the Americas, a whole new world was within reach. The Atlantic, once feared for its vastness, became a highway for commerce, ideas, and cultural exchange. Silver, sugar, and maize flowed west to east. Tomatoes, potatoes, cacao, and tobacco flowed east to west. The physical maps of the world were being rewritten, and so too were the mental maps that humans used to understand distance, trade, and power. The impact of this geographic shift was global. Economies transformed. Kingdoms rose and fell. Spain and Portugal emerged as the first global superpowers, wielding influence across continents. Native empires such as the Aztecs and Incas faced unprecedented upheaval, often succumbing to European weapons, diseases, and strategies of conquest. The world's balance of power changed, sometimes irreversibly, because geography, once a wall keeping civilizations apart, had become the stage on which empires, trade, and conflict played out. Yet, the story of discovery was not just about boldness or ambition, it was about understanding. Sailing technology, navigation tools, and accumulated knowledge of currents, winds, and stars made the crossing possible. Without the compass, the astrolabe, or the careful observation of the ocean's rhythms, Columbus's ships might have been lost to the Atlantic, and history itself would have been profoundly different. Geography set the stage, but human ingenuity allowed the curtain to rise. Even before Columbus, the Americas had existed quietly, shaping the global climate, influencing human migration, and contributing to the planet's ecology. The people who lived there had their own complex societies, cultures, and technologies. But it was the act of crossing the Atlantic, of bridging continents previously isolated from each other, that made the world truly interconnected in ways that continue to resonate today. Geography, which had defined isolation, suddenly defined opportunity. It became a tool for connection, commerce, and exploration, but also, unfortunately, conquest and exploitation. The story of August 3, 1492, is often remembered through the lens of Columbus's personal courage, the saga of his voyage, and the ships that carried him. But it is also a story of geography itself. One small ocean, one uncertain horizon, one day that seemed ordinary but would echo through centuries. Geography was no longer just a set of physical features. It had become a force shaping human destiny. Mountains, rivers, and oceans were no longer obstacles that limited life. They were highways, stages, and arenas where the drama of empires and civilizations would unfold. In the years that followed, the crossing of the Atlantic set in motion exchanges that transformed diets, economies, and societies on both sides of the ocean. Crops like maize, potatoes, and cacao would revolutionize European agriculture and cuisine. European animals, tools, and diseases would reshape life in the Americas. Trade routes, cities, and empires expanded, all because one man and his crew dared to challenge what had long seemed impossible. History is often taught as a story of battles, kings, treaties, and political maneuvering. But sometimes, the most profound changes arise not from human ambition alone, but from the ways humans engage with the physical world. One ocean, one horizon, one crossing, and suddenly, the world was larger, smaller, more connected, and infinitely more complicated. And it all began on a single day in 1492, when 3 small ships sailed into history. Geography, once a wall that separated people and ideas, had become the bridge that reshaped civilization. It reminded humans that the world was not static, that boundaries could be challenged, and that the unknown could redefine everything. The Atlantic Ocean, which had seemed infinite and terrifying, now carried the promise of discovery, exchange, and change. And in the act of crossing it, humanity took one of its first steps toward the interconnected world we know today. One horizon, one voyage, one daring decision. History would never be the same. Geography had spoken, and humans had finally listened.